Some knowledge does not inform you. It ends you and rebuilds someone else in your place. If you understand this book, your old life is over. Prologue. There are books that entertain, there are books that teach, and then there are books that erase. Because once you truly understand what is inside, your mind cannot return to its previous shape. This is not information. This is a threshold, and if you cross it, your old life will feel like a dream you can never fully re-enter. So listen carefully, because the moment you understand this book, the version of you that existed before is already ending. Chapter 1. The point of no return is always internal. There is a moment in every transformation that cannot be reversed. People think it happens externally. They imagine it is a dramatic event, a door slamming shut, a relationship ending, a fortune gained, a city left behind. They believe the point of no return is something visible, but the archive reveals something far more unsettling. The true point of no return is always internal. It is silent, it is invisible, it happens in a place no one can witness. Because the deepest endings do not occur in the world, they occur in the self. Your old life does not end when circumstances change. Your old life ends when your inner agreement breaks. That is the threshold. That is the irreversible moment. Most people live their entire existence inside invisible contracts. Contracts with fear, contracts with limitation, contracts with the familiar, contracts written so early they feel like reality. They say things like, "This is just how life is. This is what always happens. This is all I can be." And the world obeys. Because reality is structured around internal permission. But sometimes a crack appears, a moment of awareness, a glimpse of the mechanism, and the contract begins to dissolve. This is the true beginning of the end, not the end of life, the end of the old life, the one built on unconscious repetition, the one built on inherited gravity, the one built on the silent rule. People think transformation is addition, becoming more, gaining something, but the archive teaches the opposite. Transformation is subtraction. It is losing innocence, losing the ability to unknow, losing the comfort of automatic living. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot pretend you are inside fate anymore. You are inside structure, and structure can be rewritten. That is the point of no return. The moment you realize this is not destiny, this is programming, this is an internal law I have been obeying. That moment is irreversible, because it changes your relationship with everything. Money is no longer luck, it is identity. Love is no longer mystery, it is permission. Time is no longer speed, it is presence. The world becomes transparent, and transparency is dangerous, because a transparent world cannot be blamed the same way. The old life depends on blindness. It depends on not seeing the mechanism. Once you see it, you become responsible, and responsibility is the true threshold. Most people fear failure, but the archive reveals a deeper fear. Most people fear awakening, because awakening ends excuses. Awakening ends unconscious repetition. Awakening forces you to live deliberately, and deliberate living is terrifying, because it requires choice. The old life is a life of automatic agreements. The new life is a life of conscious authorship. And authorship means you cannot return to the comfort of victimhood. This is why the point of no return feels like loss at first, because you are losing the old self that survived through smallness, the old self that survived through expectation of disappointment, the old self that survived through bracing, the old self that made limitation feel like home. When awareness arrives, that home begins to collapse. And collapse feels like death, not physical death, identity death, the death of the familiar script. The archive teaches that every awakening contains grief because you grieve the years you lived asleep. You grieve the patterns you called normal. You grieve the version of you that thought life was something that happened to you, instead of something that responded to you. And once that grief begins, you cannot go back, because the mind cannot return to innocence after truth. This is why certain knowledge is forbidden, not because it is evil, but because it is irreversible. It ends a version of you, and endings are sacred. The point of no return is not when life changes. It is when you change. When you stop agreeing internally, when you stop tolerating the familiar, when you stop calling the pattern just how it is, when you begin to feel something dangerous. Expectation. Not shallow optimism, but deep internal permission. The moment you expect more, your old life is already threatened, because the old life was built on expecting less. The moment you allow safety, your old life is already ending, because the old life was built on bracing. The moment you allow love to stay, your old life is already over, because the old life was built on abandonment. The point of no return is internal. It is the moment your nervous system stops calling suffering normal. It is the moment your identity stops treating scarcity as home. It is the moment your consciousness enters the room fully and refuses to leave again. This is why awakening is not gentle. Awakening is not motivational. Awakening is disruptive, because it breaks the contract, the silent contract you lived under, and once broken, the world cannot remain the same, even if nothing changes immediately outside. Everything has changed inside. The old life continues for a while, but it feels strange. It feels like clothing that no longer fits because you have crossed the threshold. The archive calls this the inner crossing. The moment you realize, I cannot unknow what I know, I cannot unsee what I see, I cannot return to the person who lived before awareness. That is the point of no return. And it is always internal. The world may look identical, but you are not, and reality will eventually reorganize around the person you have become, not because the universe is dramatic, but because the universe is obedient. The old life was built on an old agreement. The new life begins the moment you stop signing it, and if you are hearing this, then the point of no return is already behind you, because the archive has opened, and once it opens, it does not close the same way again. Chapter 2. The old self cannot survive the truth. The old self was never built for truth. It was built for survival. That is the first thing the archive wants you to understand. The version of you that existed before awakening was not wrong. It was adaptive. It learned how to function inside what it believed was reality. It learned what to expect, what to fear, what to tolerate, what to call normal. The old self is not your enemy. It is your history. But history cannot remain in control once truth arrives. Because truth is not gentle. Truth is not an idea. Truth is an invasion. It enters the mind like light entering a sealed room. And once the room is lit, the shadows cannot pretend to be furniture anymore. This is why the old self cannot survive the truth. Not because truth destroys you, but because truth reveals you. The old self depends on unconsciousness. It depends on repetition. It depends on the comfort of familiar patterns. It depends on the illusion that life is happening to you. But the moment you see the mechanism, the illusion collapses, and the old self begins to tremble. Most people think transformation is becoming someone new, but the archive teaches something darker. Transformation is the death of the person who could not see. The old self is the one who believed scarcity was permanent. The old self is the one who believed love was unstable. The old self is the one who believed time was slipping away helplessly. The old self is the one who called the pattern life. And once you understand the rule, you can no longer call it life. You call it structure. You call it programming. You call it an internal agreement. And agreements can be broken. That is the death sentence of the old identity. The old self survives through stories. Stories like, "This is just who I am. This always happens. I'm not meant for more. It's too late." The old self is made of conclusions. Conclusions formed in childhood. Conclusions formed in pain. Conclusions formed when survival was the only goal. But truth does not negotiate with conclusions. Truth dissolves them. Truth does not ask permission. Truth arrives, and when it arrives, the old self is exposed as a strategy, not a destiny. That exposure is unbearable for the identity that depended on the strategy, because the old self does not want freedom. It wants predictability, even if predictability is suffering. The mind prefers a known prison over an unknown sky. This is why awakening feels terrifying, because awakening is not addition, it is subtraction. You begin to lose the emotional armor, the old coping mechanisms, the familiar reactions, the identity built around limitation, and the mind panics. Not because you are unsafe, but because the old self is dying. The old self will beg you to return. It will whisper, "Forget this. Go back. Don't change. Stay normal." Because normal is where it knows how to survive. The archive teaches that the old self is loyal, loyal to pain, loyal to repetition, loyal to the familiar. It will sabotage freedom simply because freedom is unfamiliar. This is why some people touch awakening, then retreat. They feel the threshold, then run back into old habits. Not because they are weak, but because identity death is real. The old self experiences truth as annihilation, because truth removes excuses, truth removes victimhood, truth removes unconsciousness. Truth says, "You have been participating," and participation means responsibility. Responsibility is unbearable to the identity built on helplessness. The old self cannot survive the truth, because the truth reveals that you are not trapped by fate. You are trapped by agreements, agreements you can rewrite. And rewriting means you are no longer the same person. The old self was built around limitation. The new self is built around awareness. Awareness is irreversible. Once you see the silent rule, you cannot unsee it. Once you notice the pattern, you cannot call it coincidence. Once you understand the mechanism, you cannot pretend you are powerless. The old self dies because innocence dies. The innocence of unconscious living. The innocence of blaming only the external. The innocence of sleep. This is why the archive is forbidden, not because it is dark, but because it ends illusions, and illusions are the womb of the old identity. When illusions collapse, the old self collapses with them. This is not tragedy, this is initiation. Every true awakening is an initiation, a passage, a death, not of your body, but of your previous internal law. The old self cannot survive the truth, because the truth demands a new normal, a new baseline, a new permission, and permission is evolution. So if you feel discomfort as you listen, that is not wrongness, that is identity shedding. That is the old self losing its grip. That is the archive doing what it was meant to do. Truth does not destroy you. Truth destroys what was never truly you. The old self was a structure built to survive the dark, but you are no longer in the dark. Light has entered, and light is merciless. It shows you the walls, so you can stop calling them the world. The old self cannot survive the truth, because the truth is not a lesson. It is a point of no return. And once you cross it, you do not become better. You become awake, and awake is a life the old self was never designed to live. So the ending has already begun. Not outside, inside. The old self is fading, and the person who remains will not be able to live the same way ever again. Chapter 3. Reality changes. When you stop being innocent, innocence is not purity. Innocence is blindness. That is one of the most forbidden truths the archive holds. Most people believe innocence is something beautiful, a softness, a kind of spiritual cleanliness. But the innocence we are speaking of is not moral. It is perceptual. It is the state of living without seeing the mechanism. It is the state of believing reality is simply happening rather than responding, and the moment innocence ends, reality changes. Not because the world suddenly transforms, but because you do. The world you experience is never the world itself. It is the world filtered through your awareness, and innocence is a filter of sleep, an unconscious veil. It makes patterns look like fate. It makes repetition look like coincidence. It makes internal agreements look like external truth. This is why awakening feels so disruptive, because it is not only your mind that changes, it is the texture of reality. The same street feels different. The same conversations feel different. The same life feels strangely foreign. Because you are no longer innocent, you begin to notice the architecture beneath events. You begin to see the silent forces, the invisible gravity, the unspoken rules, the hidden contracts, and once you see them, you cannot return to the old simplicity. The old life depended on innocence. It depended on not knowing why things happened. It depended on the comfort of mystery. But knowledge removes mystery and replaces it with structure. Reality becomes less romantic and more precise. You begin to realize that most people are not living freely. They are living mechanically, obeying scripts they never chose, replaying emotional laws installed in childhood, calling it personality, calling it life, calling it normal. Innocence is what allows the machine to continue unquestioned. But when innocence breaks, the machine becomes visible. And visibility changes everything. Because a visible machine can be interrupted, a visible pattern can be rewritten, a visible rule can be broken. This is why reality changes when you stop being innocent. The universe has not shifted. Your perception has. And perception is the doorway through which reality is experienced. The archive teaches that reality is not only external, reality is participatory, it is co-authored. It responds to what you expect, to what you allow, to what you tolerate, to what you assume is possible. Innocence is living without realizing you are authoring. Awakening is realizing you have been writing without knowing. And once you realize that, your life becomes unbearable to live unconsciously. You cannot casually repeat. You cannot casually tolerate. You cannot casually drift, because drifting is innocence, and innocence has ended. This is why some people feel a strange grief after awakening. They miss the simplicity of not seeing. They miss the comfort of blaming fate. They miss the softness of unconscious living, because awareness is heavy. Awareness is responsibility. Awareness is irreversible. The archive is not gentle. It does not soothe. It reveals. And revelation is the end of innocence. Once you understand the silent rule, money is no longer random. You begin to see how identity shapes wealth. You begin to notice how people sabotage abundance because abundance feels unsafe. You begin to notice how scarcity is not only financial, it is psychological. Love is no longer a fairy tale. You begin to see how attachment is architecture, how people chase unavailable love because availability feels dangerous, how longing is often safer than intimacy, how love is blocked not by lack of partners, but by lack of internal permission. Time is no longer a clock. You begin to see how distraction collapses life, how presence expands it, how years vanish not because time is cruel, but because awareness was absent. Reality becomes sharper, less dreamy, more exact, and that exactness is the end of innocence. This is why awakening is sometimes described as losing something, because you are losing the ability to be naive. You are losing the ability to live inside unconscious stories. You are losing the comfort of not knowing. But what replaces innocence is not despair. It is power, not power over others, power over the internal law, because innocence keeps you inside the script. Awareness gives you authorship. The archive teaches that the end of innocence is the beginning of freedom. But freedom is not light. Freedom is weight. Freedom is the weight of choice. Once you see the mechanism, you must choose differently. You cannot unknow it. You cannot pretend you did not see. This is why reality changes, because you begin to refuse the old agreements. You begin to violate the familiar baseline. You begin to live as someone awake, and the world responds, not because the universe is sentimental, but because the universe is obedient. Reality reorganizes around the person you have become. The same life cannot hold the new awareness. The same patterns cannot survive the new sight. Innocence was the glue. Awareness dissolves it. This is why people around you may react when you awaken. They feel the shift. Not because you announced it, but because your frequency changes, your tolerance changes, your baseline changes, your unspoken agreements change, and the world that depended on your innocence no longer knows how to hold you. So reality changes, not dramatically at first, but inevitably, like a tide that has already turned. The end of innocence is the beginning of irreversible living. It is the moment you stop drifting and start seeing. And once you see, the world cannot remain the same place it was before, because you are no longer the person who could live inside it asleep. Reality changes when you stop being innocent, because innocence was never purity. It was blindness. And blindness was never peace. It was simply unawareness. Now the archive has opened your eyes, and open eyes cannot return to darkness. The old life was built on innocence. The new life begins with sight, and sight is always the point of no return. Chapter 4. Why awakening feels like losing everything. Awakening is often described as enlightenment, as expansion, as freedom. But the archive tells the truth that most spiritual language avoids. Awakening feels like loss before it feels like liberation. It feels like losing everything. Not because you are actually losing the world, but because you are losing the version of the world you were able to live inside. The old life was held together by unconsciousness, by familiar agreements, by the quiet comfort of not seeing too much. And when awareness arrives, the structure collapses. This is why awakening feels like destruction, because awakening is not an addition. It is an undoing. It is the dismantling of the inner architecture that made your old life feel normal. Most people imagine awakening as gaining answers. But awakening is losing illusions, and illusions are not small things. Illusions are the emotional scaffolding of identity. They are the stories that kept you stable, the stories that said, "This is just how it is. This is who I am. This is what life gives." Those stories were not truth, but they were shelter, and awakening removes shelter. The archive teaches that the first sensation of truth is exposure. You feel raw, you feel unprotected, because the old armor no longer works. The old coping mechanisms feel hollow. The old distractions feel thin. The old patterns feel unbearable. It is not because you are broken, it is because you are awake. And wakefulness makes unconscious living impossible. This is why awakening feels like losing everything. You begin to lose the comfort of your old identity. The identity built around survival, the identity built around struggle, the identity built around limitation. Even suffering becomes familiar, even pain becomes a kind of home. The subconscious prefers a known prison over an unknown sky. So when awakening opens the sky, the prison screams, the mind panics. It says, go back, forget, return to normal. Because normal was predictable, normal was familiar, normal was safe, even if it was small. Awakening threatens normal, and the nervous system interprets threat as loss. This is why awakening feels like grief, because it is grief. You grieve the years you lived asleep. You grieve the patterns you tolerated. You grieve the love you accepted in fragments. You grieve the life you postponed. Awakening reveals not only what is possible, but what was missed, and that revelation is painful. The archive teaches that awareness is a double-edged key. It opens the door, but it also shows you the room you have been locked inside. And seeing the room hurts, because you realize the walls were never fate. They were agreements. They were invisible laws, and you participated in them unconsciously. This is why awakening feels like losing everything. It removes excuses. It removes the ability to blame only the external. It removes the innocence of helplessness. You begin to see your own role, not as guilt, as power. But power is heavy. Power means responsibility. Responsibility means you cannot return to sleep. The old self could float. The awakened self must choose, and choice feels like losing the simplicity of drifting. Most people think they want awakening until they feel what it costs, because awakening costs comfort. It costs familiar suffering. It costs the identity built around limitation. It costs relationships that depend on your unconsciousness. It costs environments that require your smallness. Sometimes awakening makes you feel alone, not because you are abandoned, but because you can no longer belong to the old frequency. You can no longer laugh at what numbed you. You can no longer desire what diminished you. You can no longer pretend. Pretending dies first, and pretending was what held the old life together. This is why awakening feels like losing everything. You lose the ability to tolerate what you once called normal. You lose the taste for distraction. You lose the patience for shallow living. You lose the comfort of unconscious repetition. The archive teaches that awakening is a kind of inner death, not a death of the body, a death of the baseline. The old baseline collapses, and collapse feels like free fall. But free fall is not failure. Free fall is transition. You are between lives, between identities, between agreements. The old self is dissolving, and the new self has not fully formed. That space feels empty, and emptiness feels like loss. But emptiness is sacred, because emptiness is where rewriting happens. This is why awakening feels like losing everything, because you are losing the old structure before the new structure becomes solid. The archive calls this the threshold phase, the corridor between worlds, the moment where you cannot go back, but you cannot yet see forward clearly. Most people retreat here. They return to old habits, old relationships, old numbness, because the threshold is uncomfortable. But those who stay, those who endure the dissolving, they discover something rare. You were never losing everything. You were losing what was false. You were losing what was too small. You were losing what was never truly you. Awakening does not take your life away. Awakening takes the dream away, so you can finally live. The archive teaches that the pain of awakening is the pain of expansion. It is the nervous system recalibrating. It is the identity shedding. It is the old rule breaking. And breaking feels like loss, because the old life depended on the rule. But once the rule breaks, freedom enters. Not as a feeling at first, as a possibility, a new air, a new gravity. So if awakening feels like losing everything, it is because you are. You are losing the old self, the old agreements, the old blindness, and what remains will not be the person who lived before. That is why this book is irreversible, because awakening is not comfort. Awakening is the end of the old life, and endings always feel like loss until you realize they were openings all along. Chapter 5. The mind will beg you to forget. The moment you begin to wake up, the mind will panic. Not because awakening is wrong, but because awakening is unfamiliar. The archive teaches something most people never realize. Your mind does not exist to liberate you. Your mind exists to preserve you. It is a survival machine, a pattern protector, a guardian of the known, even when the known is suffering, especially when the known is suffering, because suffering, if familiar, becomes safe, and safety is the mind's highest religion. So when truth arrives, when the silent rule is revealed, when the old life begins to dissolve, the mind will beg you to forget. This is not metaphor, it is mechanism. The subconscious does not want freedom. It wants predictability. Freedom is unknown. Unknown is danger, so the mind interprets awakening as threat. It whispers, "Stop listening. This is too much. Go back to normal. Forget this," because normal is where it knows how to function. The archive calls this the resistance of the old self. The mind is not evil. It is loyal. It is loyal to the identity that survived. It is loyal to the baseline you have lived under. It is loyal to the internal contracts you have signed for years. And awakening is the breaking of those contracts. Breaking contracts feels like death to the subconscious, because the subconscious equates identity with survival. To change is to die, not physically, psychologically. So the mind begs you to forget. It will do it subtly. It will not announce itself. It will create distractions, sudden urges, sudden tiredness, sudden skepticism. It will say, "This is just nonsense. This won't apply to me. I'll think about it later." Later is one of the mind's favorite spells. Later is how awakening is postponed into oblivion. The archive teaches that the mind will always try to delay transformation, because delay preserves the old law, delay preserves the old comfort, delay preserves the old suffering. This is why so many people touch truth and then lose it. They have a moment of clarity, then return to the familiar fog, not because the truth disappeared, but because the mind pulled them back. The mind begged them to forget. For some, the mind uses logic. It intellectualizes. It argues. It turns awakening into philosophy instead of change. It says, "Yes, interesting, but life is still life, and nothing shifts." For others, the mind uses emotion. It floods you with fear. It says, "If you change, you will lose people. If you awaken, you will be alone. If you stop agreeing, everything will collapse." And fear becomes the leash. For others, the mind uses comfort. It offers pleasures, numbness, scrolling, noise, anything to prevent stillness. Because stillness is where awareness grows, and awareness is what dissolves the old self. The mind will beg you to forget because forgetting is safety. Forgetting allows the pattern to continue unquestioned. Forgetting allows the silent rule to remain invisible. This is why the archive is forbidden, because the archive does not allow forgetting. Once you see, you cannot fully unsee, even if you try. But the mind will try. It will attempt to shrink the revelation, to turn it into a passing thought, to bury it under routine, because routine is the mind's strongest anesthetic. Routine makes the extraordinary feel distant. Routine makes awakening feel like a dream. The archive teaches that the greatest battle is not with the world. It is with the returning sleep. The mind will always offer sleep, because sleep is easy. Sleep is familiar. Sleep requires no authorship. Sleep allows life to happen automatically. Awakening requires choice. Choice requires courage. Courage requires discomfort. And discomfort is what the mind avoids at all costs. This is why the mind begs you to forget, because forgetting keeps you inside the old gravity. But here is the deeper forbidden truth. The mind begs you to forget precisely because the truth is real. If the truth were meaningless, there would be no resistance. Resistance is the evidence of rupture. The old self resists because the old self is ending. The mind does not beg you to forget trivial things. It begs you to forget what would change everything. This is why, after awakening, you may feel a strange pull back to old habits, back to old relationships, back to old thinking, back to old limitation. This pull is not failure, it is gravity. It is the baseline fighting to remain baseline. The archive teaches that transformation is not a single moment. It is a sustained refusal to return, a refusal to re-sign the old contract. The mind will beg you to forget, but you do not have to obey. You can watch the begging. You can witness the resistance. You can name it. And naming weakens it, because what is seen cannot govern invisibly. This is the archive law. Awareness breaks hypnosis. The mind's begging is hypnosis breaking. So when the mind whispers, "Forget this," that is the exact moment to listen deeper, because that whisper is the gate. On the other side of that gate is the new life. The mind will beg you to forget, because forgetting would keep you safe inside the old self. But you were not meant to remain safe. You were meant to awaken. And awakening is always the betrayal of comfort. So the question is not whether the mind will beg, it will. The question is whether you will return, because once you have heard the archive, the old life cannot fully hold you again, even if the mind tries, even if the world tries, even if sleep calls you back. The truth has entered, and truth does not leave politely. It stays, it rewrites, it ends the old self. The mind will beg you to forget, because it knows, if you remember, your old life is already over. Chapter 6. The world treats you differently after you see. There is a strange consequence of awakening that few people speak about, not because it is rare, but because it is unsettling. The moment you truly see, the world begins to treat you differently, not always through dramatic events, not always through obvious changes, but through subtle shifts, invisible rearrangements, a quiet difference in how reality meets you, because the world is not only external, the world is relational, it responds. And once you see the mechanism, you are no longer the same participant. The archive teaches that perception is not private. Perception alters presence. Presence alters frequency. Frequency alters the way life interacts with you. This is why awakening is never contained. It leaks, it radiates, it changes the atmosphere around you. Before awakening, you moved through life unconsciously. You accepted what was normal. You tolerated what was familiar. You repeated patterns without naming them. You lived inside the silent rule, and the world, obedient, reflected it back. But after you notice the rule, after innocence breaks, your baseline changes, your tolerance changes, your posture changes, and reality cannot remain identical in the presence of a different internal law. The world treats you differently because you stop treating yourself the same. That is the first secret. Most people believe the world changes first, but the archive reveals the opposite. The internal shift comes first, then the external response follows. When you see, you become less negotiable, not aggressive, but clear. The old self tolerated fragments. The awakened self cannot. The old self accepted scarcity as normal. The awakened self feels its violence. The old self accepted unstable love as fate. The awakened self sees the pattern. The old self lived distracted. The awakened self notices absence. So your choices change, and choices alter reality. This is why the world begins to treat you differently. Some people will feel it immediately. They will sense something in you that they cannot name. A quiet refusal, a new gravity, a different frequency. Because awakening is not only understanding, awakening is embodiment. And embodiment is visible, even when unspoken. The archive teaches that people respond more to your internal law than to your words. You can say nothing and still be felt. Once you see, you stop performing unconscious roles. You stop shrinking automatically. You stop agreeing silently. And the world notices the absence of your old compliance. This is why awakening can create friction. Not because you became wrong, but because you became less predictable. Predictability is how systems maintain control. Families maintain patterns through predictability. Relationships maintain dynamics through predictability. Society maintains scripts through predictability. And awakening disrupts scripts. When you see, you no longer play the same part. You no longer accept the same treatment. You no longer tolerate the same emotional ceiling. So the world reacts. Sometimes people will pull away, not because you are unlovable, but because your awakening confronts their sleep. An awake person is a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable. Sometimes people will challenge you, not because you are wrong, but because your new boundaries threaten their old access. Sometimes people will misunderstand you because they knew the old version of you, the version who agreed, the version who endured, the version who remained inside the silent contract. But that version is fading, and the world treats you differently because the world was built around that version. This is why awakening can feel lonely at first, not because you are alone, but because you are between frequencies. The old world recognizes you less. The new world has not fully arrived. You are in transition. The archive calls this the threshold existence, the corridor between identities, and in corridors, echoes change. The world treats you differently because you begin to emit a different expectation. Expectation is not hope. Expectation is instruction. Before, your instruction was, "This is all I can have." Now your instruction becomes, "I will not live beneath unconscious rules." That instruction changes everything. Money responds, opportunities respond, love responds, time responds, not because the universe suddenly favors you, but because your internal agreement has changed. You stop walking through life as someone waiting for life to happen. You begin walking through life as someone awake inside it. And reality responds differently to an awake presence. This is why synchronicities often increase after awakening, not because magic begins, but because attention sharpens. You notice, you are present, you see patterns, and seeing patterns is a form of participation. The archive teaches that the world has always been speaking, but the sleeping cannot hear it. When you awaken, you hear, and hearing changes the dialogue. The world treats you differently after you see, because you are no longer invisible to yourself. The greatest invisibility is self-abandonment, and awakening ends self-abandonment. You begin to stay with yourself. You begin to witness yourself. You begin to choose yourself. And the world cannot treat you the same once you stop leaving yourself behind. This is the forbidden truth. The world's treatment of you is deeply connected to your own internal permission. When permission expands, life expands. When tolerance collapses, old patterns collapse. When awareness enters, the old scripts weaken. So, yes, after you see, the world treats you differently. Not always immediately, not always gently, but inevitably. Because reality cannot remain aligned with a person you no longer are. The old life was built on unseen agreements. The new life begins when you see them, and once you see, the world begins to respond to the person who is finally awake. Chapter 7. The Hidden Door. Only opens. Once, there is a door in consciousness that cannot be opened casually. It does not appear for everyone. It does not remain visible forever, and once it opens, it does not open the same way again. The archive calls it the hidden door, the threshold of irreversible seeing. Most people believe awakening is a gradual staircase, a slow accumulation of insight. But the archive reveals something stranger. Awakening is often a door, a single passage, a moment, a fracture in perception, and once you cross it, your old life becomes inaccessible, not because the world changes instantly, but because you do. The hidden door is not external, it is internal. It opens when you finally understand something you cannot ununderstand, when the silent rule becomes visible, when the pattern becomes undeniable. When innocence collapses, that is the door, and it opens only once, because the first time you see is different from every time after. Before the door, you live inside the script. After the door, you see the script. And seeing the script ends the possibility of full unconscious participation. This is why the door is sacred. This is why it is dangerous. Most people spend their lives circling the door without entering. They feel something. They sense the mechanism. They hear whispers of truth, but they retreat. Because the door demands a price. The price is the old self. The price is the familiar life. The price is the comfort of sleep. The archive teaches that the hidden door is not a gift. It is an initiation. Because once you cross it, you cannot return to the same ignorance. You cannot fully believe the old stories again. You cannot fully tolerate the old patterns again. You cannot fully pretend. The door opens into awareness. And awareness is irreversible. This is why some people fear awakening without knowing they fear it. They say they want change, but what they truly want is improvement without crossing. They want more comfort without losing the old identity. But the hidden door does not offer that. The hidden door offers transformation, and transformation is not comfort. Transformation is ending. The archive teaches that the door opens when the internal agreement breaks. When you stop agreeing with scarcity, when you stop agreeing with abandonment, when you stop agreeing with unconscious time loss, when you stop calling the pattern normal. That refusal is the key, and the moment the key turns, the door opens. But here is the forbidden truth. The door does not stay open forever. Not because the universe is cruel, but because consciousness is a living threshold. If you see the door and retreat too many times, the mind will cover it again. The mind will anesthetize. The mind will distract. The mind will return you to familiar sleep, because the mind prefers predictable suffering over unknown expansion. So the hidden door opens only once in its full power. The first glimpse is the purest. The first rupture is the strongest. After that, you either cross or you spend your life remembering that you almost did. This is why regret is so heavy. Regret is the memory of the door, the memory of the moment you could have crossed. The archive teaches that the hidden door appears when you are ready to lose your old life, not your external life, your internal law. The door opens when you are ready to stop being who you were, because the person you were cannot live on the other side. The other side requires new permission, new baseline, new normal. The hidden door only opens once because it is not a recurring opportunity. It is a rupture in identity. It is the moment the old self cannot fully survive. It is the moment you realize, I cannot unknow this. I cannot unsee this. I cannot return. That realization is the door. And once you step through, Life begins reorganizing, not as a miracle, as mechanics. The old patterns weaken, the old gravity shifts, the old agreements dissolve, because you are no longer inside them blindly. The hidden door is the end of unconscious life. It is the beginning of authorship. And authorship is irreversible. This is why awakened people cannot fully fit back into their old environments, not because they are superior, but because they are no longer asleep. The door has changed them. They cannot pretend again. They cannot tolerate again. They cannot shrink again. The archive teaches that the hidden door is the most sacred threshold in human existence, the moment you stop being innocent and begin being awake. So if you feel something in you recognizing this, that is not imagination. That is the door. The door is near. The archive does not open it for everyone, but it has opened it for you, and it will not open the same way again, because once you see the door, you are already standing at the point of no return. The only question now is, will you step through, or will you spend your life knowing you almost did? The hidden door only opens once, and some knowledge is the door itself. Chapter 8. The cost of knowing is the death of normal. There is a price that comes with real knowledge, not information, not trivia, not ideas you can repeat and forget. Real knowledge, the kind that changes perception, the kind that alters the structure of the mind. The archive calls this the cost of knowing, and the cost is always the same, the death of normal. Most people think the greatest cost of awakening is discomfort, or loneliness, or change. But the deepest cost is far more subtle. You lose the ability to live normally again, because normal was never neutral. Normal was a spell. Normal was unconscious agreement. Normal was the familiar baseline that kept the old life intact. And once you know, normal collapses. You begin to see what you once overlooked. You begin to feel what you once numbed. You begin to notice the invisible laws beneath daily life, the patterns, the scripts, the silent contracts. And the world you once called ordinary becomes transparent. This is the death of normal. Normal life depends on not seeing too much. Normal life depends on accepting surface explanations. Normal life depends on calling repetition just how it is. But once the archive reveals the mechanism, you cannot return to surface living. You cannot casually tolerate what you now recognize as a pattern. You cannot casually participate in what you now recognize as unconsciousness. Normal becomes impossible. This is why awakening is irreversible. It does not simply give you insight. It removes the old veil, and the veil was what made normal feel stable. The archive teaches that normal is a collective hypnosis, a shared agreement to not look too deeply, to not question too far, to live inside accepted limits. Normal is the world of inherited scripts: work, consume, repeat, desire, chase, postpone, love, fear, withdraw, time, waste, regret. Normal is sleep, and knowing is waking. Waking kills normal, because once you are awake, sleep becomes visible. You see how people live inside loops. You see how they obey rules they never named. You see how scarcity is psychological, how love is permission, how time is presence, and the ordinary world begins to feel strange, not because it changed, but because you did. The death of normal is the end of unconscious comfort. You lose the ability to distract yourself the same way. You lose the ability to pretend certain things are acceptable. You lose the ability to shrink back into old baselines. Normal entertainment feels hollow. Normal conversations feel thin. Normal goals feel small. Because normal was built for the old self, and the old self is dissolving. This is why many people resist knowing. They sense that knowledge will cost them something. They are correct. Because knowing is not a gift without consequence. Knowing is a threshold. Once crossed, you cannot return to innocence. The archive teaches that ignorance is not merely absence. Ignorance is protection. It protects normal. Normal is predictable. Normal is familiar. Normal is safe, even if normal is limiting, even if normal is painful. The mind prefers normal suffering over unknown expansion. So the mind begs you to forget, because forgetting resurrects normal. But true knowing does not fully disappear. It lingers, it haunts, it reshapes. Because once the invisible is seen, it cannot be unseen completely. Normal dies because you begin to live with awareness, and awareness changes everything. Money is no longer just money. It becomes a mirror of worth. Love is no longer just romance. It becomes a mirror of safety. Time is no longer just time. It becomes a mirror of presence. And when everything becomes a mirror, life becomes deeper. But depth is incompatible with normal. Normal is shallow by design. Normal keeps you functioning. Awareness makes you questioning. Questioning makes you disruptive. Disruption makes you free. Freedom kills normal. This is why awakened people often feel out of place. Not because they are above life, but because they can no longer live inside unconscious agreements. They cannot pretend. They cannot numb. They cannot tolerate. They cannot casually return. The archive teaches that the death of normal is the beginning of real life, because normal life is often a half-life, a life lived in distraction, a life lived in postponement, a life lived under inherited laws. Knowing ends that. Knowing demands authorship. Knowing demands presence. Knowing demands a new baseline, and a new baseline is terrifying, because you must build it consciously. Normal was inherited. Awareness must be chosen. This is the cost. You lose the comfort of default living. You lose the ease of unconscious repetition. You lose the ability to call the pattern fate. You gain freedom. But freedom is weight. Freedom requires choice. Choice requires courage. Courage requires discomfort. So the cost of knowing is not knowledge itself. The cost is what knowledge destroys. It destroys normal. It destroys unconscious comfort. It destroys the old agreements. It destroys the life you could have lived asleep. And that destruction feels like loss, until you realize what was lost was never truly life. It was a script, a baseline, a hypnosis. The archive does not offer normal. The archive offers truth, and truth always comes with a price. You cannot go back. You cannot unsee. You cannot return to the old world, because the old world was built on not knowing. The cost of knowing is the death of normal. And the death of normal is the birth of the irreversible life, the life that begins when you finally stop living by default and start living awake. Chapter 9. You cannot unlearn what you become aware of. There is a cruelty to awareness, not because awareness harms you, but because awareness cannot be undone. The archive teaches one of the most irreversible laws of consciousness. You cannot unlearn what you become aware of. Once something is seen, it cannot return fully to invisibility. Once a pattern is named, it cannot return fully to coincidence. Once the mechanism is revealed, it cannot return fully to mystery. This is why awakening is a point of no return, not because life changes instantly, but because perception changes permanently. Most people believe they can go back. They believe they can hear something profound, then return to normal life unchanged. But the archive knows the mind may try, but the soul does not forget. Awareness is not information. Awareness is alteration. It changes the shape of the observer, and the observer is the doorway through which reality is experienced. So once awareness enters, reality cannot feel the same again. You may still live in the same house. You may still speak to the same people. You may still walk the same streets, but something has shifted underneath, a silent rupture. Because you know, And knowing changes everything. The archive teaches that ignorance is not simply not knowing. Ignorance is a state of innocence, a state of unseeing. And once innocence breaks, you cannot repair it. You cannot pretend you did not see the rule. You cannot pretend you did not notice the pattern. You cannot pretend you did not recognize the silent contract beneath your life. This is why awareness feels heavy, because it removes the comfort of unconsciousness. Before, you could call it fate. Now, you call it structure. Before, you could call it bad luck. Now you call it repetition. Before, you could call it just how it is. Now you call it an internal agreement. And agreements can be broken. This is the burden and the gift. Once you become aware, you cannot return to helplessness without discomfort, because awareness creates responsibility, not guilt, responsibility. Responsibility means you see your participation, you see where you tolerate, you see where you expect less, you see where you shrink, you see where you return to familiar suffering. And once you see, you cannot unknow. Even if you try to ignore it, it lingers, it whispers, it remains. The archive teaches that awareness is like a door opening inside you. Once open, air enters, light enters, and the room cannot return to its previous sealed darkness. The mind may try to close the door. It may distract, it may numb, it may postpone, but the crack remains, because you have seen. This is why the mind begs you to forget, because forgetting would restore the old comfort, but true awareness does not fully disappear. It becomes a silent companion. It follows you into old habits and makes them taste different. It follows you into old patterns and makes them feel unbearable. It follows you into old conversations and makes them feel thin, because you cannot unlearn what you become aware of. The archive reveals that awakening is not a single moment. It is a permanent shift in perception. Once you realize money responds to identity, you cannot see money the same way. Once you realize love responds to permission, you cannot chase love the same way. Once you realize time responds to presence, you cannot waste life the same way, even if you fall back sometimes. The fall feels different, because you know you fell. Before awareness, repetition was unconscious. After awareness, repetition becomes a choice. And choice changes everything. This is why some people feel restless after awakening. They can no longer settle into the old baseline peacefully. They can no longer live asleep without feeling the tension of knowing. The archive calls this sacred discomfort, the discomfort of outgrowing, the discomfort of leaving the old self behind, because awareness is evolution, and evolution is irreversible. You cannot evolve backward. You can resist, you can delay, you can distract, but you cannot truly return. Once awareness enters, the old life begins to dissolve, even if slowly, even if quietly. Because the foundation has cracked, the silent rule is no longer invisible, and invisible things only control you when unseen. This is why awareness is liberation, because it breaks the hypnosis. The world may still offer the old scripts, people may still live inside sleep, but you cannot fully join them the same way, because you have seen the door. You have heard the archive. You have recognized the mechanism, and recognition is irreversible. The archive teaches that the greatest transformation is not what you do, but what you can no longer do unconsciously. Once you become aware, you cannot unknow your worth. You cannot unknow the pattern. You cannot unknow the possibility of rewriting. Even if you try to return to normal, normal will feel haunted by the truth. Because truth does not leave politely. Truth stays, truth rewrites, truth ends the old innocence. So yes, you cannot unlearn what you become aware of. That is why this book is dangerous. That is why it is sacred. That is why it is irreversible. Because once you see, your old life may continue externally for a while, but internally, It has already ended. The archive has spoken, and awareness does not go back into silence. Chapter 10. The Archive Seal. The old life is over. There is a moment when the archive closes, not because the knowledge disappears, but because the knowledge has already entered you. This is the seal, the final threshold, the point where the old life cannot remain intact. The archive does not end with comfort, it ends with truth, and truth is always a kind of ending. Most people believe endings are external, a door closing, a chapter finishing, a relationship breaking, a life changing. But the archive reveals the deeper ending. The old life ends internally first. It ends the moment you can no longer live unconsciously. It ends the moment the silent rule becomes visible. It ends the moment innocence collapses. It ends the moment you realize, I cannot return. This is the seal. The archive seal is not a punishment, it is an initiation, because what you have seen cannot be unseen. What you have understood cannot be unknown. The old self cannot survive the truth. Normal cannot survive awareness. Sleep cannot survive light. So the old life is over, not as tragedy, as inevitability. The old life was built on inherited agreements, agreements with scarcity, agreements with abandonment, agreements with unconscious time loss, agreements you did not choose, but obeyed. And now those agreements have been named, and naming breaks spells. The archive teaches that the strongest prisons are invisible. They are not made of walls, but of assumptions, of baselines, of what feels normal. Your old life was not only a set of circumstances, it was a set of permissions, silent permissions that shaped everything, and once permission expands, the old structure cannot hold. This is why awakening feels irreversible, because you are no longer the person who could live under the old ceiling. The ceiling is still there, but you see it now, and what is seen cannot remain absolute. This is the final truth. The archive does not give you a new life. It removes the illusion that you were trapped in the old one. It reveals that reality has always been responding to identity, to safety, to presence, to the unspoken law beneath everything. And now you know. The seal is knowledge, the seal is awareness, the seal is the end of unconscious participation. The old life was the life of drifting. The new life is the life of authorship. The old life was the life of repetition. The new life is the life of choice. The old life was the life of sleep. The new life is the life of sight. This is why the archive is forbidden. Because it does not allow you to return to normal. It does not allow you to forget. It does not allow you to live by default again. Once you have heard this, you will notice patterns everywhere. You will notice where you shrink. You will notice where you tolerate. You will notice where you expect less. You will notice where the silent rule still whispers, and noticing is the beginning of rewriting. So the archive seal is simple. Your old life is over, because you have become aware. And awareness is the point of no return. Final phrase, sealed in the archive. Some books do not end with the last page. They end with the last version of you. If this volume reached you, it was not an accident. The archive is still opening. More forbidden knowledge is coming. Subscribe now and remain inside Hidden Library Archives, because once you understand, there is no going back.